Hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to see so many people. So I'm here to talk to you about Norwich State Hospital and its impact on my family. And there were 4 women in my family tree who were patients there, and then one went on to be an employee. And my book, Secrets of Asylum, is the story of how I used their patient records to uncover secrets that were hidden in my family. So I did my research primarily to answer my own questions about what went on in my family, and I hope to share it with my siblings and their children. And obviously, in order to do that, I didn't need to publish a book. So I have a couple of reasons why I wanted to share my story beyond my own family. And one of them is to talk about the value of history, especially family history. Knowing where you come from has long-lasting effects on your well-being. And in the book, I even cite a couple studies that make that point. But in addition, I uncovered family secrets that, told me, I learned about trauma, and it showed me how this past trauma in my family, its effects trickled down to my own generation. So as a result, I think of genealogy and family history as ways to empower people and to heal old wounds. And the other reason I want to share my story is because it's a fascinating family saga, and I think it's one that even a non-genealogist would enjoy reading. I wrote it in the form of a narrative, so it reads like a novel. But along the way, while I was writing the book, I had to learn some things. Like I had to learn about the history of French Canadians in New England. I had to learn something about mental health care in the first half of the 20th century. And I also had to learn how to use genealogy to answer my own questions. So all of these things are incorporated in the storyline without slowing the story down. And it informs and hopefully entertains the reader. And basically, I wrote the kind of book that I personally like to read. So let me tell you a little bit about my mother, because she's basically the reason this all started. She was born in 1925, and she grew up in Connecticut. And she started out in Stonington, later moved to Danielson, and then on to Norwich. And she went to Norwich Free Academy for high school and graduated in 1943. And then she went on to the University of Connecticut and graduated from there in 1947. So then, on her own, she made her way to Washington, D.C. to further her studies. And around the same time, my father did the same thing from Indiana. And they actually met in the library at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. So they married in 1948, and then in 1951, they moved out to a Maryland suburb called Wheaton, Maryland. And then they started having children, and I am the third of their 6 children. So my mother had dabbled in genealogy, I guess starting about the same time that I went into high school, but I really wasn't interested in genealogy because I thought it was dry facts, like, who begat whom, and, when they married and where they died. And what I really wanted was, I was interested in her story. She told these stories, and I wanted, to know more detail. So the thing is, there are several stories that she told that I've woven together into the book, but I'm going to talk about 2 tonight because they also give an example of the kind of research I did in order to create this book. One of the stories she told was, she said, when my mother was a child, she lived in a shed. Her father deserted her mother and went back to Canada, causing her mother to go insane. Some doctor thought it was a good idea to pull out all her teeth. And then this is the one that I was told the most often. My mother had an uncle who set her up in business running a delicatessen in Stonington. During the Great Depression, the business failed. When I was 7 years old, my mother became mentally ill and was sent to a mental hospital, and I was taken from my father and put into the county home. Now, my mom did not like it if I asked her too many questions, and she really didn't like it if I suggested that her father had abandoned her. And she always said, that he had been a wonderful father, even though he divorced her mother while she was in the state hospital, and he never got my mother out of the county home. And then the other thing I remember asking her was, what kind of doctor pulls out all of a person's teeth in order to cure their mental illness? And, and I asked Mom, and she was like, well, that's what I was told. And I later realized that she got a lot of her family history from her mother, who was a paranoid schizophrenic, so perhaps not the most reliable source. So the thing that bothered me about genealogy was that no matter how much research she did, nothing ever changed about the story she told. And what I wanted was a more complete family story, and it just seemed to me, well, genealogy is not giving me that, so I wasn't interested. But in 2012, when my mother was 87, she had to go into assisted living, and I had to take all of her genealogy research files because it wouldn't fit in her room, and I put them in the basement of my house, planning to just hang on to them until somebody in the family expressed some interest. And but the librarian in me could not resist going in and straightening things up and organizing them, and I didn't realize that at the time, but I was on the slippery slope from being a reluctant genealogist to a relentless family historian. So when I poked around the boxes, what I was surprised that I didn't find was not very much about my grandmother's time at the so-called mental hospital, but I did find these 2 letters that were sent to her, and the envelope says Norwich State Hospital. So, until that time, I really wasn't sure where this mental hospital was. But now I had a name, and of course, in the age of the internet, I Googled or whatever, internet searched, and very quickly found out that the state archives at the Connecticut State Library, they have a lot of the records from Norwich State Hospital, and unfortunately they couldn't save them all, but because they just took up a lot of room. But in my case, I was happy because they did have all the files that applied to my family. So what I did was I had to send proof to the archivist that I was actually a direct descendant of a deceased Norwich State Hospital patient, and he said, okay, now I will go look for her records. And so he did. A few days later, I got an email, and he said, I found your grandmother's file, but what we do is we always see if there's any other family members. They somehow maintain the relationships. I don't know how they do it, but anyway, he said, we have 3 more family members of yours, and so I got the records for all 4 of them. So let me just go over quickly who I'm talking about. So Graziella was my great-grandmother, and she was there from 1908 to 1910, and her sister Rose was there from 1924 to 1925. My grandmother Beatrice was there from 1935 to 1944, and her sister Pauline was there from 1929 to 1930. And then in addition, Beatrice had another sister named Honora, and she spent the last 20 years of her life at Kings Park State Hospital in New York. So to sum it up, not only was Grandma mentally ill, but so was her mother, her aunt, and both of her sisters. So here's an abbreviated tree, and I apologize, I realize probably y'all back there can't see them, but Pauline is my mother. She was named after her aunt Pauline. And Beatrice and Frank Tillotson are my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, and then Graziella and Philippe Metti were Beatrice's parents, and then Pierre and Isilda Bonneau were Graziella's parents. So what is in the patient records? This is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of the kind of things that you might find. It's like, the application for a commitment, visitor logs, progress notes, casualty records, list of clothing received with the patient on admission, and that sort of thing. But one of the things that I learned was sometimes even the tiniest bit of information in a record might help provide proof of a bigger story, and you'll see that happen in one of the stories I follow. So, but the most useful thing was called the social history of the patient and their family. And the hospital social worker and the staff interviewed my grandmother, my grandfather, and then just any relatives that they could find, and to find out facts about Beatrice's life, and also, how her mental illness unfolded as they saw it. But the other thing was they also said, who they were, how they were related to her, and where they were living. So that was like a genealogist's gold mine. And then the other thing, though, later on, there's when she was being considered for parole, they went out to those same relatives and they asked them, whether they were willing or able to be responsible for her if she were to go out on parole. And so they asked the same people and sometimes even found more people. But the interesting thing was she also kept notes about who should not be responsible for Beatrice and why. And I found some family secrets that way that I wouldn't have known otherwise. But what I didn't find in the records was very much about how they treated mental illness. There was nothing in there like, a treatment schedule and how they did, which really was kind of surprising. So I kind of had to sort of make some suppositions based on what I did see in the patient records. But then I also, I read, believe it or not, I read all of the Norwich State Hospital biennial records from the beginning up to about 1958, which was the last year I had a family member there. And there were also newspaper articles. And finally, I did find a 1939 report. There had been the state legislature ordered this investigation into conditions at Norwich State Hospital. So I read that too. And the point was, if I couldn't find it in the patient record, I just wanted to get a sense of what their lives would have been like in a place like Norwich State Hospital. And then finally, I read some general works on the subject, which turned out to be very helpful. So let's start with the story of my great-grandmother Graziella and the story about the shed. So her parents, Pierre and Isilda Bonneau, left Quebec in the late 19th century. And like a lot of French Canadians, they had come down south into New England to find work in mills and factories because the farming up in Quebec for small farmers like my ancestors, they were near starvation at times. And so they were looking for a better life. Although I did read something about mill workers and the French Canadian in New England, and I feel like their dreams of a better life maybe not fully realized because, there were things like they had to work, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they didn't get paid real well. So anyway, Pierre and Isilda's daughter, Graziella, married Philippe Medi in 1899, and both of them worked at the Quinnebog Mill, which I got these pictures from the Killingly Historical Society, and the mill is in Danielson, which is a borough of Killingly. And the other thing so they had my grandmother in 1901, she was their first child, and then by 1907 they had 4 children, and somehow they were living in a shed. So one of the things that the patient record did for me was help me figure out where this shed was. So there was a letter, again, I know you probably can't read this from where you are. This is a letter from Graziella's sister, Alexandrine, and she's writing to the superintendent and saying basically all those 4 children of Graziella's are being cared for by her parents. So Pierre and Isilda are raising them. So of course it seemed to me if there was a shed, it would be on the Bonneau's property. So I wondered if I could, how do you prove somebody had a shed in their backyard over 100 years ago? And also I wanted to know why they might have had, their family members living in a shed. So one of the next things I did was I had to figure out, well, who was living with them at the time? And what I discovered was the Bonneaus still had 6 children of their own living at home. These are French-Canadian Catholics, as you know. So there were 2 daughters in their 20s, and 2 daughters and a son in their teens, and then another son who was 11. And then also Pierre's elderly mother was living with them. So, that's pretty crowded. So then I thought, well, what kind of house did they live in? So I used the census record and also town records from Danielson and what I determined was, long story short, they were living at 32 Cottage Street in Danielson. And they lived there from 1897 to 1925. So I looked for that address on Google Maps, and it looked like a relatively large house, like right on the railroad tracks. So I thought it seemed like, shouldn't they have had enough room for Graziella and Pierre? Graziella and Philippe and their kids. But what happened was, here's a reference resource you don't usually think of, is I went to Zillow.com, the real estate website, because one of the things it tells you is what year buildings are built. So I found out that 32 Cottage Street was built in 1910, and I'm like, that doesn't fit in with the timeline that I learned. So I thought, well, now I need to see if I could find some maps from around the same time that they were living in the shed. So I know this says Baltimore because the first time I gave this talk, it was in Maryland. But anyway, this is the Sanborn Fire Insurance maps were created. They documented all the business and residential structures in populated areas, and basically their job was to figure out how susceptible each structure would be to damage or destruction by fire. And the thing is, and they did this I think they did 12,000 different towns and a few in Canada and Mexico. But the thing is that these maps were developed for fire insurance companies and underwriters, but as time has gone on, they've become very valuable resources for people like historic preservationists or genealogists and family historians. So anyway, I found a map from 1911, and I don't know if you can see it, but so this is 32 Cottage Street, and I'll compare you with the Google map, and they're not in the same place. And so this was how I realized, I went back to the Historical Society and I said, oh yeah, the houses were all renumbered after 1920. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So anyway, so comparing these 2 maps, so I don't know if you can see this little square there? That's a shed. And I don't know if it shows up very well for you, but if you look at the Google map, I've got it marked too, and those 2 places have a similar footprint, including the shed in the back. So then I went back to Zillow, and Zillow said, on Zillow it said that house had been built in 1884, which was made a whole lot of sense. So anyway, the other thing that surprised me greatly when I found out that the house is now 65 Cottage Street. Again, go to Zillow, and the thing is that not only did I find the information about when the house was built, it was on the market. And so I was like, okay, and apparently the real estate market up in the quiet corner isn't as raging as in the Washington, D.C. area, because I didn't get there for a few months. It was still on the market. So I got a real estate agent to let me see it. And it was a small house, had 5 bedrooms and 1 bath, and all the rooms were tiny. And in fact, like, I think 2 of the bedrooms were upstairs, and you know how the roof slopes. I mean, it was tiny. And so I'm thinking, okay, you know, all those people living there, of course, Philippe and Alex and Graziella came looking for somewhere to stay, and all they had to offer was the shed. So the other thing was that the real estate agent let me look at the shed. She unlocked it for me, you know, and it was surprisingly small. I think my living room is bigger than that. But anyway, the other thing was she let me inside, and I was just sort of looking around, trying to take it in, and the agent pops her head in and she says, "Oh, look at that wood. You know, all that wood, the roof sheathing and the floorboards, that's 19th century wood." And I was like, wow. And that's when I realized I was standing on the actual floorboards where my grandmother had been as a child. And it was very moving for me in the sense that, I'll be honest with you, my grandmother and I did not have a good relationship, and for reasons that will be clear later in the talk. But this was an opportunity for me to, you know, have some empathy for her as a child, and also acknowledge the hardships that she went through as a child. So while they were living in the shed, though, that's when Graziella started showing signs of psychosis. And there was a fire, and also so she had a miscarriage, and of course she's got 4 kids and her husband in a tiny shed. That probably contributed to it. So she started hearing voices, and then she would rave, and she said she wanted to kill herself, and that she also wanted to kill Philippe. Philippe had to go to the town selectman to see if he could get Graziella admitted to a state hospital, because like he couldn't work and leave her with the kids, and of course her parents had plenty going on without them. So anyway, and that involved, at the time, it involved going to the probate court of the town. And so in this case, there were 2 doctors that examined Graziella, and then they testified that she was indeed mentally ill. And then Philippe was ordered her to take her to Norwich State Hospital without delay. So in 1908, Norwich State Hospital for the Insane, as it was called at the time, had only been open for 4 years, and there were 4 patient ward buildings, and the administration building had just been completed, and that's the building on the left side there. So when Graziella was admitted, there were 434 patients there, which doesn't sound like a lot, but there was only the buildings were only designed for 400. So, you know, 4 years into its history and it's already overcrowded. And over the years, more and more patient buildings were built, and the hospital was always characterized as being overcrowded. So when Graziella was first admitted, she was diagnosed with manic depressive disorder, and she was sent to this building called North B, which was later renamed the Bell Building. And in the weeks that followed, she said she was depressed and wanted to kill herself, and things weren't looking really very good. And then she's kind of started pulling out of it in the late summer and early fall of 1908. And so here's some samples of the notes that were there. I won't read the whole things, but like the first one says she's much more cheerful. And this one from September 2nd, 1908, much brighter. And then September 11, 1908, much more cheerful. So this is all encouraging. But then the next note was more than a month later, and it was kind of grim. It says, about 3 weeks ago, the patient became disturbed. She threw away her teeth, and they have down the toilet, and they have not been found. So then the word teeth caught my eye, because didn't Mom say, you know, that some doctor thought it was a good idea to pull out all her teeth? So what I did was I went back to her patient record where they had a physical description of her upon her admission, and it says her teeth are fair. So she had her own teeth when she was admitted, and then sometime, Mom was right. Some doctor thought it was a good idea to pull out all of her teeth. But then I wanted to know, well, but why? And this is where the reading that I did on the history of mental health care came in handy, because by that time I came across this one theory that they had that around the time when she was a patient, there was a theory going around that mental illness was caused by hidden infections in the body, and that one of the most likely places for them was the teeth. And this theory was reported in like medical journals and newspaper articles, and state hospital superintendents sort of jumped on this as, okay, this is going to solve our problem. And so unfortunately, a lot of people got their teeth pulled like that in those days. And in the book, I just discuss how many of these so-called therapeutic methods were just sort of launched on these mental patients without knowing really or testing them to find out if they were really effective or even safe. So anyway, after the incident when she threw her dentures down the toilet, Graziella's condition steadily declined, and the notes in her record are just farther and farther apart, and they're very terse. They were not good. So it just seemed like the hospital staff had given up on her. And then in March 1910, she was sent to this building, North D, which was later renamed Dix. And that at the time was a ward for disturbed patients. Well, she never got better, and then in December 1910, after a short illness, she died at the hospital. So having my great-grandmother's patient record helped me confirm parts of Mom's story about the teeth and the shed. But the part that she had said about, that Philippe had left Graziella, causing her to go insane, was not true, because he wrote letters to the superintendent asking about her condition, and he visited her as often as he could, although understanding that he was a mill worker and living in Danielson. And he actually visited her the day before he died and brought a priest with him for last rites. So that sort of gets him off the hook a little, except he was no angel. So I found this newspaper article in the Norwich Bulletin about he was accused of stealing somebody's necklace, and he had an accomplice, which was a woman he was living with in Norwich. And so this was in April 1910, and Graziella was still alive. So I'm sure that Pierre and Isilda were just scandalized and, of course, totally embarrassed that the story had appeared about their son-in-law in the newspaper. So after Graziella died, Philippe left his 4 children in the care of the Bonneaus, and then I was trying to figure out where he might have gone, and Mom had said Canada, but I really couldn't find any evidence of him there. So I kind of thought I'd reached a dead end. But then one day I was, let's see now. Ooh, I forgot to update this. Never mind, we'll work around it. Anyway, I had a really pretty slide, but I forgot to put it in this version. Anyway, this is from the 1920 census. I was looking just for any relative with the last name Meddy, and I came across this man named Philip D. Meddy, and he had a wife named Marie and a son named Charles. And Philip Meddy had the same year of birth, same place of birth, Canada. And also, all the way at the end, it says his occupation, which is really hard to read. It says loom fixer. So he was a mill employee. And I was thinking, I was wondering if, this was my great-grandfather. But the thing was, the son here, Charles D., was born the same year as one of Philippe's children. So I was thinking that's a little off. So I thought, well, did he have a secret family, or is this just 2 different, families? So what I did was I went back to the 1910 census because I knew where Philippe was at that time, and I thought, well, if I find this family group in Maynard, Massachusetts, that's where they were, in 1910, I'll know it's a separate family. But then I didn't find them there, so then I thought, so maybe that is my great-grandfather. And then I thought, well, who is this woman, Marie E.? And so I thought, well, in 1910, she was probably married to someone else. So I thought, okay, well, I don't know if any of you have used like Ancestry.com to search the census, but they do let you limit geographically. And you know, Danielson's a pretty small place. So I thought, well, why don't I search for her and Charles with no last name because I don't know it, but have like, you know, the ages and, you know, the place of birth and stuff like that. And I thought, you know, if that doesn't work and I have to broaden my search geographically, it's going to be hopeless. But what I did was I found a family group with Marie and Charles, same ages and places of birth, but they're living with George Meddy. And then I went back to my genealogy stuff and I realized, oh yeah, Philippe had a brother named George. And so what I did was I stumbled on another family secret, was that Philippe didn't go back to Canada like my mother told me. He ran off to Massachusetts with his brother's wife and child. So anyway, so that was the story. And there's more to that story, but I'll leave it for you to read in the book. So anyway, the last thing I have to say about this myth that he had gone back to Canada, I believe was a cover story that was told to children to shield them from like all the I mean, Philippe apparently was very embarrassing. And so that was the story. And then when they got older, nobody felt that it was necessary to like say what really happened. So I don't know, they may have found out, but I didn't know. So anyway, my grandmother dealt with a lot of family upheaval between the ages of 6 and 12, and I didn't even tell you all of it. And then what happened was her grandparents, Pierre and Isilda, died just like a couple of years after Graziella died. So she and her siblings were eventually just raised by their aunts. So her life as a young woman wasn't a whole lot better, and this is where the story of the delicatessen and the mental hospital and the county home come in, and I pieced together this part of the story using the patient records from Norwich State Hospital. So my grandparents met like in the early 1920s, and they couldn't be more different. So Beatrice was petite, dark-haired, French-Canadian and Catholic, and Frank was tall, fair-haired, Anglo-American, and Protestant. So both of their families objected to the courtship just on religious grounds. But the other thing was that Beatrice's aunts were not happy because they felt that since they raised her, that she owed it to them to stay and continue to bring in money to support the family. And then I think Frank's parents were a little bit concerned because by that time, you know, Beatrice had gotten a reputation as being kind of a difficult personality. But anyway, despite the family disapproval, they married in 1922. But after 2 months, she left him. And she went to live in Stonington. Now, how many people in the room recognize what this is? Okay. So that's the Water Street Cafe on Water Street. There were actually 2 buildings that were the delis, but that my family was involved with, but that's the first one. So she went to Stonington to live with her Aunt Blanche and Blanche's husband, Napoleon Goyat, who they had an apartment upstairs, and then they ran a delicatessen on the ground floor. And then after 3 years of living there in the apartment with them, Beatrice became pregnant. And the family lore was that Frank and Beatrice continued to see each other even through their separations. So what happened was then Napoleon set Beatrice to run the delicatessen and reunited her with Frank. And then they moved their family to Mystic. Napoleon Goyet's family moved to Mystic, and he started a grocery store. And so my mother was born, and she spent the first 6 years of her life at this delicatessen in Stonington. So One of the things that happened at the delicatessen was Beatrice started showing signs of being psychotic, and she would sometimes go into a trance, but then other times she would like either laugh hysterically or cry uncontrollably. But the other thing she did was she accused Frank of having sex with his stepmother, and then she verbally and physically abused them. And so the other thing about, and this was like in 1928 and 1929, and I got that information out of the patient record. And the thing is, when I read that and I thought, oh my goodness, my poor mother was like a 3 or 4 year old, and she's just watching all this going on, and it must have been like very difficult for her to understand what was going on. So then in 1931, during the Great Depression, like probably the worst year of it, the delicatessen failed, and then Frank, Beatrice, and Pauline had to move back to Danielson. And Beatrice became depressed over losing the deli, and then her behavior just got more and more disturbing. And then for his part, Frank was very irritable with her because he was a veteran of World War I, and he had been mustard gassed in France when he fought there, and also he had what was called shell shock, which we now know is post-traumatic stress disorder. But so what happened was Beatrice would get unruly, and Frank said, the only way I know how to control her outburst is to beat her up. And again, now my mother is living with this, and she's a young girl, and this must have been distressing. So one night in 1935, they had a really terrible fight, and after it was over, the state police were called, and when things settled down, then the state police called the Connecticut Humane Society, which had a children's division, and they called because they were concerned about Pauline's well-being in the home, as well they should. So the result was that Beatrice was taken to Norwich State Hospital, and in her interviews with the hospital staff, I was able to learn the real reason why the delicatessen failed, and I wouldn't have known this without having access to her patient record. So without spoiling this for those of you who haven't read the book yet, I'll just read you this little snippet. So this is what she said to the hospital staff shortly after being admitted. You see, my husband is not a fit man physically or mentally to have children. I have had relations with my uncle, and my child has been sickly ever since she has been born. He said it was nothing as we were relations, and I felt it was the only way out. So after reading this, I became even more determined to find out like what happened to the deli, and also, who was my mother's real father, Frank or Napoleon. Now, in the meantime, Pauline was taken away from her parents to the New London County Temporary Home, and she wasn't allowed to stay with Frank, probably because of his history of domestic abuse, but also probably because he had a lot of health problems of his own, and having his wife and his child both in institutions where he didn't have to take care of them, then he could get treatment for his own problems. So the county home was a place for neglected and uncared for children. That's where they were placed, and it was called a temporary home because it was meant to be a holding place for children over the age of 6 who would either be placed in a foster home or perhaps even return to their home if the situation at home, got better. But the reality was that during the Great Depression and also World War II, the state agencies were overwhelmed just trying to place the children who were too young to go into the county homes. So the result was my mother lived there from 1935 to 1941, which was from the ages of 10 to 16. And there are about 80 children in the county home, and they even had a school there. It went up to the 8th grade. The other thing that was interesting about it, it's like less than a mile from Norwich State Hospital. So Beatrice actually could go and visit her daughter a couple times a year maybe. And Frank also visited in the early years, but after a while he stopped coming. So after Pauline graduated from the county home school, she went to Norwich Free Academy, and Beatrice only had a 8th grade education, and she kind of scoffed at the idea of Pauline going to high school, and she used to say, all that book learning is going to crack your head. So, but anyway, nevertheless, my mother persisted in her education, and she was encouraged by her teachers and also the social worker. Later on, there was a social worker assigned to her case, and she won awards and grants, and she got a scholarship to the University of Connecticut. So that was one of the happier parts of the story. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Beatrice was diagnosed with dementia praecox, paranoid type, or what is now called paranoid schizophrenia. And she was assigned to the Mitchell building, and that's a picture of it. Now, she was said to be well-behaved and a hard worker on the ward. And what I came to understand about her, first of all, she was very clever and adaptable, but also that Norwich State Hospital for her was really a true asylum, because it was a place that kept her away from these abusive situations that she was encountering outside the hospital. So I'm going to skip forward to 1939. So there was, I mentioned earlier, there was a state report on the conditions at the hospital, and the upshot of it was, I mean, it was interesting to me to read this report because it was in 1939, so it was like right in the middle of the years that my grandmother was there. So of course, this is another chance for me to get any sense of what her life had been like. But anyway, after all the dust settled, there was a new superintendent named Dr. William A. Bryan. And he actually shook things up, and he made some changes that I think actually benefited my grandmother and made her, gave her more opportunities for independence, and eventually these things helped her get discharged. But then, while he's trying to do that, then the United States joins World War II, and then he had problems staffing the hospital because of that. The thing is that it had always been difficult to get male attendants because most men could make more money in the trades, like being a carpenter or a plumber or whatever. But then with the war, men joined the service, and then other men who didn't join the service found higher paying jobs in the defense industry. So Dr. Bryan had to come up with a creative way to solve this problem. Now, one of them, which I won't go into here, was that conscientious objectors were placed in state hospitals all over the country. So Norwich got a few of them. But what was really interesting to me was he recruited attendants from the patient population. I'll read this thing from his report. The use of patient attendants is something that 2 years ago would have seemed impracticable and almost too absurd to think about, say nothing about put into actual practice. About 10 months ago, when we began to feel the acute shortage of attendant personnel, it was decided to try using some of our patients as attendants. Well, my grandmother Beatrice was among the first of patients to be given that opportunity. And she actually did pretty well there. So in 1943, she was doing well enough that she was up for parole, and they really needed her, so they decided what they would do is parole her to the hospital, but they moved her to employee housing, and then she continued her attendant duties. And her parole was renewed twice, and then on October 26, 1944, she was discharged. But she didn't have anywhere to go because in the meantime, Frank had divorced her and he married somebody else. So she stayed in employee housing, and she lived there and worked at the hospital for 14 more years. And then in 1958, she retired. She reunited with Frank, whose second wife had died, and they remarried. So, I mean, that still just blows my mind, and I've known this for years. So anyway, learning about her history at Norwich State Hospital, I began to admire my grandmother's ability to adapt and succeed despite suffering from a serious mental illness. Unfortunately, I just didn't have much of a relationship with her. She would come down to our house in Maryland maybe once or twice a year, and every visit was just incredibly stressful, and especially for my mom, because she would follow my mother around everywhere she went and criticize like everything she did. And then every visit also included at least one incident where Beatrice would blow up in anger, and one time it was because Mom had run out of instant coffee. Now, at other times, she might sit on the couch and it was like she was in a trance, the lights would be low, and she just acted like she didn't even know we were there. So as a young child, I'm like, I just kept my distance. And the fact is, she died in 1966 when I was 10. And then Grandpa moved in with us. So he moved down from Connecticut and moved into our house in Wheaton, and that made Mom very happy. She always, adored her father. But then he died a few months later, sadly. So I feel fortunate that I was able to access Graziella and Beatrice's patient records, because they just answered so many questions that Mom either couldn't or wouldn't answer. And I now know how traumatized she must have been, witnessing domestic abuse, watching her mother descend into mental illness, being sent away and separated from the family, and then just living with these feelings of loneliness and abandonment and shame. But I suspect she would have been unhappy had she known that I had uncovered all of the family secrets. But I felt from the beginning, when I started this, I felt like I needed to give myself a sense of entitlement. It was always presented to me as, this is Mom's history, this is Mom's genealogy. Now, wait a minute, it's my family history too, and I felt like I had a right to know what happened, and I had a right to figure out for myself what I thought it meant, and so I did. Anyway, that's all I have for you right now. I'd love to take some questions if y'all have any. Yes?
The New London County home, where was that located, do you know?
She was asking where the New London County home was. I think it's on Laurel Hill Road. It was eventually acquired by Norwich State Hospital, and they eventually named it after Dr. Bryan. So it was known as the Bryan Building. So that's all I can tell you verbally, but go look it up on a map. Any other questions? Yes?
Are there any plans for that building? Any plans for the building?
Well, the property the part of the hospital that's in the town of Preston has been acquired by the Mohegan tribe, and they're going to develop it. And they have torn down many of the buildings, but they have kept the administration building up, and my hope is that they will keep it up as some way to remember historically the fact that there was a hospital there. There's a little piece of the hospital that's actually in the town of Norwich, and that's across the street from the main complex most people know about. And that's where the county home building was. And see, that was a bit of luck for my mother. Her parents were poor and couldn't educate her, but because she lived in the town limits of Norwich, she was eligible to be a student at Norwich Free Academy, which from my understand is a pretty darn good school. And so she got a pretty good education for a poor little girl from the county home. But anyway, I went off on a tangent, but that's what I know is I don't know what's going to happen to the buildings and things that are in the town of Norwich, but I do know that the Mohegan tribe, basically they have had to do a lot of environmental mitigation, and there's PCBs and asbestos, and who knows, there might be oil tanks buried in the ground, I don't know what, but they have been doing a lot of work trying to make it safe before they can start developing on it. And I hope they're successful on it. And I do hope, like I said, that they save the administration building. You have a question?
Was there anything in your research about the farm at the hospital?
I read about it. The thing is that I never intended this book to be like a complete history of Norwich State Hospital. So, well, had I had a relative who was a farm worker, I would have delved into it more. But yeah, the farm was huge and had an amazing output. It did help feed the patients. I'm sure that was a boon especially during the Depression. But I really can't say much more than that. Like I said, I cherry picked in a way things that revealed more to me about what might have happened to my family members. So, yes?
How does one access hospital records?
Okay, that question was how does one access the hospital records? Well, you do what I did, which is you find that web page. I can tell you, you just type in Norwich State Hospital patient records in a search engine, and then that page will come up. And there's a contact link somewhere on that page. That's what I did. I just wrote them and I said, my grandmother was there. Do you have their record? Now, they're not going to release the records to someone who isn't a descendant. But I don't want to speak too much about their policies because, they might have changed. But anyway, that's the easy way to find how to do it is you find that web page, you look for the contact us link, and you just write them. And they're very responsive and really helpful. So they're not trying to, protect them, but they do have certain rules they have to live by in order to respect family members, privacy and confidentiality. So, somebody back there, and we'll get you, okay?
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I started working there in 1961, and there was 3,100 patients.
Yeah.
And when they closed in 95, there were 600.
Yes, I believe that 1955 was like the high water mark in terms of the population there. It's just incredible. Do you have a question?
Yeah, you mentioned I think they were biennial reports of Norwich State Hospital. Were those from the Connecticut State Library as well?
Oh, yeah, you could probably get them from there. I'll tell you, I'm lucky because they were also at the Library of Congress where I used to work. Another thing is, you might want to write this down because I didn't put it. There's a very good online book resource that you probably can find the Norwich State Hospital biannual reports, and it's called the Hati Trust, but let me spell it for you. So the URL is catalog.hathi.org. And I've done so many different kinds of research, historical research on that site, but I was able to get a lot of those reports that way. So I hope that helps you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
This is just such an incredible amount of work, and I'm wondering what were the biggest challenges you faced as you were writing this book?
That's a hard question. What were my biggest challenges? There were, one of them was having to drive up to Connecticut, which is a long way for me. I think one of the biggest challenges for me was what it did to me emotionally, and I do talk about that in the book. I mean, I recommend that anybody who is digging up family secrets to get a therapist. Honestly, that I think was one of the biggest and ongoing challenges is that, but I was trained as a librarian, so to me it was like I was doing my job. The most of the research, I mean, I liked it. I hadn't done so much writing before, and so that was kind of different. But I also had taken creative writing workshops. I don't know, I think I started in 1996. I was always interested in writing. I didn't feel like I had a topic. And then this fell in my lap, and I was like, I know what to do. So I just went for it. But yeah, there's all kinds of challenges. I'll tell you, the pandemic was a big challenge. and also trying to get this book published through a conventional publisher. It was the unending rejection, and then the pandemic came, and you know, I'm always a low-level anxiety person anyway, and I'm telling you, the pandemic came, and my anxiety just went through the roof. And on top of that, I thought, I'm going to keep sending this in and keep getting rejections. I can't do this. So that was a challenge. I actually put this whole project away for 2.5 years, and I worked on some other things. I worked on some local history projects, and what happened was, at some point I said, I'm giving everybody the benefit of my knowledge, how to research, and giving them their family history. What am I doing about mine? And so finally, I guess maybe 2 years ago, I just said, you know, I'm just going to self-publish. I just skip all this, and I'm glad I did. But so these are the kind of challenges. I think the research and the writing were a lot of work, but I was like, I loved it. It kept me out of trouble. And the emotional stuff was really hard. And also just figuring out how to get it in a way that I can hand it to people, you know, and say, this is what I did. This is what I learned. So anyway, those are the kinds of things. And I started this in 2012, and the book was finally published in 2023. So it gives you an idea of kind of how much work it was. It was really part of my life, and it still is. But I feel like I've jumped over a wall, and I'm in another yard now, you know, and I can do different things.
Thank you, Julianne. It was fascinating.
Oh, thank you. Thank you all for being a great audience.